It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Student Academic Symposium Committee. We're going to start the symposium off with two presentations that were voted on as outstanding representatives of student achievement here at TLU. The first one is Sara Soefje. Sara is an accounting major. She is getting a BBA in business and a BS in accounting. So she's on the 5-year plan. She is going to sit for a CPA exam this summer, and it has a position lined up at Fisher Hepps Kimball, accounting firm in San Antonio, starting next year. So she's going to present her talk first, and so welcome, Sara.
Thank you, Dr. Jonas. A pension is a promise to pay an employee a fixed amount for life. It's easy to make this promise. It's easy to make any promise, but it's not always easy to make the payment. Pensions are complex and they're expensive and they're easy for companies to ignore. So as baby boomers get ready to retire, pensions might become an IOU that they can no longer afford to pay. Just to start off, before its restructure, General Motors offered their employees pension plans, benefit plans to be precise. In 2004 alone, General Motors was required to set aside $99.9 trillion for its pension fund. This is a sizable amount. A pension fund this large ended up creating a pension expense of $2.5 trillion. This was roughly 52% of its pre-tax income. By 2008, this expense had increased to $3.2 trillion. Obviously, this ended up being a contributing factor to their problems, and the thing is, they're not alone. Pension plans are a type of post-retirement benefit plan, and there are two ways that employers can account for these benefits until they're paid to employees upon retirement, as either a defined contribution or a defined benefit plan. Defined contribution plans are discussed more in my paper, but they're typically what we think of as a 401k. Defined benefit plans, on the other hand, are the product of a formula, and these are the ones that are promising a future benefit and causing financial issues in companies today. When looking at defined benefit plans, there are many estimates involved. This makes them very susceptible to employer manipulation. So in an effort to increase the reliability of these estimates, the SEC requires the use of an actuary. Now, an actuary is a third-party individual, independent from the organization, that evaluates a number of assumptions. These assumptions can include employee lifespan, retirement age, changes in compensation, long-term rates of return, and so on. They then use these actuarial assumptions to create the pension benefit formula, which then calculates the projected benefit obligation. This projected benefit obligation is the actuarial present value of all benefits expected to be paid to employees and is the minimum amount that employers must set aside for their pension fund. If this minimum balance is not met, the employer is then required to fund the deficit through their own contributions. To avoid having to pay these contributions, employers are able to invest funds that have already been contributed to the pension plan in what are called plan assets. These assets can be stocks, bonds, basically anything that creates a return, because this return then lowers their costs and provides a means of income for the pension fund. When it comes time to create the financial statements at the end of the fiscal year, employers must recognize what's called the net periodic pension cost. This is the main expense associated with pension plans, and there are 5 components: service cost, interest cost, actual return on plan assets, any net gains or losses, and then the amortization of any prior year service costs. Service cost and interest cost are both related. As mentioned earlier, the projected benefit obligation is the present value of all the benefits expected to be paid overall. The service cost is the portion of this present value that has been provided in the current period. Now, in dealing with a present value, this is an amount that's been discounted from a future time to today. So the interest cost is the portion of this, or it's the interest associated with the discounted amount that is attributable to the current period. At the end of the year, the fair value of the plan assets are measured and then compared to the fair value they were at the beginning of the year, and this difference is the actual return on plan assets. This can be a positive or a negative amount, with gains lowering the employer costs and losses increasing their costs. It's actually interesting to note that when the economy is doing very well, the return on these plan assets has been known to be so high that it completely offsets all of the other expense components and actually creates a net periodic pension income, although this hasn't happened anytime recently. Lastly is the amortization of prior service costs. Occasionally, an amendment is made to an existing plan which results in a change in the benefits to be paid. These benefits are then amortized over a number of years using either straight line or an accelerated method, with the unamortized amount remaining in other comprehensive income. So now, while all of this may seem relatively straightforward, there are many factors affecting these calculations, and oftentimes an employer will create what's called a pension spreadsheet to help aid these calculations, and then this also helps them understand the various costs involved. So this is an example. It's a pretty basic example, but this is a pension spreadsheet. It's not too involved, and I know the print came out larger than I thought it would, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what all can go into accounting for pensions. So after going over the components, you can see why companies might be experiencing funding issues. As a result of chronic underfunding, some individuals estimate that public pension plans are short almost $2 trillion. This would amount to nearly $87,000 per plan participant. S&P estimates that several of its Fortune 500 companies are faced with funding shortfalls up to $260 billion. And additionally, several state and local governments are short anywhere from $500 billion to $1 trillion. The deputy mayor of Albany, Howard Wolfson, addressed the funded status of the city's pension plan when he stated, "We've seen how General Motors became a pension plan that also made cars. Unless we make real changes, New York City's government is in danger of becoming a pension fund that occasionally delivers city services to the people that live here." While there are many issues involved in the underfunding of pension plans, the primary cause comes from employers refusing to lower their expectations. For years, the returns on plan assets were extraordinarily high. The economy was doing very well. This meant that employers didn't have to worry so much about making contributions. However, when the recession hit in late 2007, the return on these assets dropped dramatically. Employers didn't initially adjust their forecasts, thinking that we would pull out of the recession and bounce back relatively quickly, but that didn't happen. As time went on and the returns remained low, employers were faced with a new problem. If they were to adjust their expectations and recognize the lower return on these assets, which would be more realistic, they would then recognize huge deficits in the funded amount. Just to give a few examples, if the Colorado Public Employees Retirement Association were to adjust their expectation to a more reasonable estimate, they would face a $23.4 billion deficit. If they were to use an even more conservative rate, this deficit would jump to $34 billion. Also, from 2005 to 2009, there were several Fortune 500 companies that expected roughly $475 billion in returns, when in actuality, they only received $239 billion. This is an almost 50% undershoot. So companies can't afford to continue with overly optimistic expectations, but at the same time, they can't afford to adjust their expectations because then they'd have to face the deficit amounts. Before pension plan funding issues became as prevalent as they are today, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation provided a way out for businesses. PBGC is a federal organization that takes on orphaned pension plans that businesses no longer wish to maintain. As funding issues became more widespread, many companies were willing to pay very high amounts to get rid of their obligations. UPS was willing to pay an estimated $6.1 billion to get rid of their pension liability. So you can imagine what the underfunding on their pension plan must have been for $6.1 billion to just be nothing. While the PBGC worked well for some time, it's becoming increasingly underfunded itself. As a federal organization, it's run on taxpayer dollars. So as these are used up, the only way PBGC can take on more pension plans would be to raise taxes, which no one really wants to happen. Typically, when corporations experience losses, they try to smooth them or amortize them over a number of years. As a change, though, many big-name corporations such as AT&T, Verizon, and Honeywell are beginning to sweep pension losses, recognizing these major losses in the year they're incurred. As you can see from this graph, these three companies have major unrecognized losses in the billions. So while sweeping these losses makes the financial statements more transparent, it also allows room for improvement. These companies take a short-term hit for a possible long-term gain. But there's a catch. When these companies opt to recognize these losses, they do so in previous years. This requires them to do a prior period adjustment and then restate these prior year financial statements. As mentioned earlier, AT&T has opted to recognize their pension losses. So looking back at 2008, this required an adjustment, or they had to recognize $23 billion in pension losses. So when they adjusted their financial statements, they had to decrease their net profit from a $12.9 billion profit to a $2.6 billion loss. So the catch is that all this occurs in prior years. Investors are no longer analyzing AT&T's 2008 financial statements as a basis for their investment decisions. So by taking this hit 3 years ago, AT&T doesn't have to own up to their losses today. As a way to keep investors informed, the SEC does require companies that recognize these losses to disclose them in the current year financial statements. However, at the same time, the SEC requires roughly 27 disclosures related to the general accounting procedures for pension plans. So when you look at General Motors' 2008 10K and its 18 pages of notes on its pension plans alone, you can see how an investor might not find that their company has opted to sweep their losses. So I'm not here tonight to teach you how to account for pensions, but it is important for people to understand and appreciate the complexity involved in pension accounting and the magnitude of the burden they place on companies. Entities that offer pension plans have numerous SEC requirements that they have to meet, so this explains why many are willing to just blow past the problems. General Motors was a prime example. Recall from the beginning, General Motors reported a $3.2 billion pension expense in 2008. This was undoubtedly one of the problems that led to its bankruptcy. Since then, General Motors was restructured, handing off its renegotiated pension liabilities to the PBGC. Looking forward, entities that offer these pension plans and are struggling with these future payments have limited options. They can recognize the lower returns and fund the deficit amount. They can take the short-term hit and sweep their losses, or they can face the possibility of an eventual bankruptcy. In the end, the choice is theirs, but an action of some kind is inevitable. Thank you.